This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft. Because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. Hello and welcome to this week's Storyworks Roundtable. Today I have a special guest joining me in my home. This is my good friend, Susan Wolter. We did our MFAs together at Hamline University. And I asked Susan to join me at the round table to talk about artist grants. This is especially relevant now, I think, as many artists have been impacted by work reduction, work loss in this time of COVID-19. Yep. And there are resources out there for artists, but happily, this information is also evergreen. So whether you are applying for a grant now because your work situation has been impacted, or 5 years from now, it's still going to be relevant.
Yes.
Yes.
And it's relevant for not only grants, but for fellowships, mentorships, residencies. A lot of opportunities for artists. Definitely.
Now, Susan is a writer with an MFA in creative writing from Hamline University, our joint alma mater.
Yes.
While at Hamline, she was a graduate teacher and an assistant fiction editor of Waterstone Review, Volume 19. Susan has been twice honored with the Minnesota Artist Initiative Grants in Prose. She served as a 2020 Prose panelist for the Minnesota State Arts Board and participated in the 2014 Loft Mentor Series, where she subsequently screened fiction applications to the program. She can mostly be found at home, in her basement, with her neurotic dog and opinionated cat, working on a novel. Sounds like a true writer's life.
It is. In our basement.
Yes. Yeah. Now, before we start going deep into tonight's topic, can you distinguish or define for us what an Artist Initiative grant is here in Minnesota, your particular grant, from the Loft Mentor Series? So just kind of let us know what those two things are.
The Artist Initiative grant was a grant, a sum of money that was used for a specific project. In this instance, it was a novel project. Mm-hmm. The Loft Mentor Series was a year-long mentorship. It was a group of 12 individuals of the three disciplines: fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. And we spent a year working with 6 different mentors that came into the program at different times during the year and worked with us. So it was more of a long-term working relationship.
Excellent. With the mentors in each of those 3 categories.
Yes,
in
yes.
Each of the genres.
And you worked with all of the genres. Yep. So there were 2 fiction, 2 nonfiction, and 2 poetry. So,
yeah, that's really cool. Now, and you are currently finishing up a grant year, correct?
I am, yes. I was fortunate enough to receive the 2019 Artist Initiative grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board. Mm-hmm. It was made possible by the voters of Minnesota through this grant from the Minnesota State Arts Board, State's Art Board, thanks to legislative appropriations from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. So, thank you, Minnesota, for supporting your artists.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think it's important as we get into this conversation to let all of our listeners know that while we're talking about your experience here in the state of Minnesota specifically, many states have grants for artists, and all over the country there are public and private organizations or nonprofits, so there are lots of ways to find artist grants. So don't think you need to be in Minnesota to receive a grant.
No, that is not the case at all. But that is my experience. So
right. So what have your 2 Minnesota Artist Initiative grants allowed you to do? How have they impacted you as a writer?
Oh, they have been really, they've been really tremendous growing experiences for me as an artist. The first one was for short stories. There was a travel component to it. I traveled to North Dakota, and it was during the Bakken oil boom stuff going on, and did a lot of research there. And I have been able to draw on that experience ever since in all of my writing. So that was a great experience. My latest grant, the 2019 grant, was to work on a novel. So I spent 2019 spending my time focused on being able to write. I wasn't trying to, think of ways to make money in other ways, or it gave me some money for a manuscript editor. Actually quite a bit of money for manuscript editors because they're expensive. And so they should be, because they're going to give you a lot of time and attention. So it was really an opportunity to spend time on this novel. I was able to extend the contract and work on it for an additional 6 months. This was an extension of time, not, additional money. But it's really gave me 18 months of focused time on this novel. So it was, and it's been a tremendous growth period for me. So as an artist, so I highly encourage people to apply for grants. Fellowships, mentorships, residencies. Sometimes there are workshops that you can go to that are paid for. They can have a huge impact on an artist's career.
Absolutely. So. Yes, and I think another thing people will want to know, they're probably wondering, okay, so you had 18 months and hired an editor, so how much money is that? What does it mean when you get a grant? And I know there's a huge range. It really depends grant to grant, and sometimes you can apply for a grant might have a maximum amount you can apply for, but you don't have to apply for the full amount. So as we're whetting people's appetites for, okay, now I've got to get out there and find me a grant and get my application done. What does that look like in terms of the package? What you might be able to do realistically? There are grants from $1,000 grants all the way up to like a $25,000 MacArthur fellowship. So anything in between there, right.
And it can be, each individual grant is different. That's kind of the thing that you really need to, spend some time researching. What does this grant allow you to do? Is that what you're looking for? Some grants allow you to travel, some do not. Some grants allow you to purchase equipment. Some don't. So it's really looking at what you're trying to do and put together, find grants that are that fit into that.
Right.
I guess.
Right. When I was an emerging artist, shall we say, some number of years ago, I received a month-long residency at the Anderson Center, which came with a $500 stipend from the Jerome Foundation. So you might think, okay, $500, it's not life-changing. But then I know there are some local Twin Cities arts organizations where you can apply for up to $5,000, and the state level you can apply for up to $10,000. So I just want people to realize this is significant money. So when we say that you can actually reduce your concern about paying your monthly bills and spend more time being an artist, that's real.
That is real.
Yes. Wonderful.
Okay.
So who are grants for? Let's kind of define some terms as we go into the conversation. I know I've already used the word emerging artist, so established, emerging, traditional, indie, creative, business related. Can you give us a sense of who grants are for and what we can do with them? We've already touched on it. Let's just go a little broader.
It really depends on the grant, and I think there are grants for all of those different stages of a person's career. Some are really more focused towards people in the latter stages of the career. Maybe they're doing some work to change a little bit as an artist, but they're already very well established, as in they've, published significantly or have books to their credit. And then there are grants that are trying to assist emerging writers, people that have not written, that don't have a published book. And then there's some gray areas between if it's indie published or traditionally published. So you'd have to look at the different grants to see when they say published, exactly what that means. But
right, because with some granting agencies, if you have self-published a book or indie published a book, that will disqualify you from being categorized a certain way, as, for example, an emerging artist. But with other agencies, it's only if the book is traditionally published that you shift categories as an applicant. So you need to really read the application materials.
Yep, the guidelines.
See where
Follow
you fit.
The guidelines carefully. Yep.
So talk about the guidelines. That's a perfect segue, right?
The guidelines. This probably seems like it should go without saying, but you really do have to follow these guidelines very, very carefully. The manuscript, the length of the manuscript, if there's a minimum or a maximum, if you go, if there's too few pages or there's too many pages, the application could be thrown out for that. They will tell you if it's something where you're going to budget your expenses and come up with some sort of a, here's the number I'm applying for, they'll tell you what sort of expenses are allowed and which aren't, and what sort of things are allowed. Is travel allowed or not? The Minnesota State, the Artist Initiative grants do not allow travel outside of Minnesota, but they do allow travel within the state. So, you just need to kind of look at what is allowed in that particular grant to see, whether it's a good fit for you.
So let's say you decide it is a good fit for you and you're going to apply. What is the process of applying for a grant? What does that look like? Generally, I think they're almost all online any longer. There's a manuscript that's going to be required, and after that, it can change quite a bit depending on the grant. Okay.
There's probably some sort of a plan or proposal there. What are you trying to do? There may be a budget, or maybe the grant is just a fixed dollar amount. And you don't have to get into specific budgeting, but there might be a budget, and there may be some need for a resume or a CV. And sometimes I see grants now asking for an impact statement.
Okay.
And an impact statement is talking about your work and how it impacts the greater community and what that can bring to the world as art.
Okay. So when you say manuscript, you mean a writing sample, right? You don't mean like 50 to 100,000 words. Give them the whole book. Right.
The manuscript is a sample. Yes. For prose, it's, I think, often 10 pages.
Okay.
Sometimes less, sometimes a little bit more. As having been a panel judge, when they're 10 pages and you've got 50 of them, that's some reading to do. And that's, that's before the applications, before the bios, before, all the other things that are part of that package. So, 10 may not sound like a lot, but when it's in this big pool, 10 pages is quite a bit.
Definitely. So as the artist, as the writer submitting these 10 sample pages, what do we need to know as we prepare those 10 pages?
Probably the most important thing to know is that manuscript is the most important thing in that application. That is what's going to catch the reader's attention. So much is kind of hinges on that manuscript that you really, really need to select that manuscript carefully. It needs to be your very best work, for instance. Okay. I probably wouldn't start something new, something you've written in the last, 3 weeks for this application. you're going to want something that's very polished. The competition is fierce. You need these manuscripts to really shine.
Yeah, so on the one hand, you want it to be very polished, but on the other hand, let's say you're applying for money to help you fund time for a work in progress or something. So what would you say about matching the writing sample to your project description? And what if the project is for a work in progress, so maybe it's not your most polished work yet? What would you do? How would you approach that situation?
Ideally, it is work for the project, because when the panelists are reviewing these manuscripts, what they're going to be looking for is how feasible is this project, and if you've got this manuscript started and they can look at it and see, what great work it is, that's going to carry a lot of weight. So ideally it is, but it's 10 pages. Then I would be taking, 10 pages from that manuscript and putting a lot of time and effort into polishing it to be something, that really shows you off well as an artist.
Right. So, okay, so your writing sample, polished it, extremely polished, and also relevant to the project you're applying for.
That's right. Now, let's say it's for, let's say it's a novel and you haven't started that novel, but you have another novel that you've already completed. You could maybe use a piece of that work that's very similar, so that the panelists are going to be able to see that you have the ability to do this work. Right. I'd get a little nervous about, putting like a fiction manuscript there for a writing sample, and your project is nonfiction or something. You're switching genres. Then you're going to need to explain why that's, okay. Or how are you going to make that transition over to nonfiction.
Right.
And if you are using an excerpt from a novel, it's okay. It doesn't have to be a complete storyline. But you're going to really want to look at where the most dynamic part of that story is. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the beginning. It can be the beginning. Sometimes the beginning, though, has a lot of setup. So you have to be a little bit careful about what you pick. On the other hand, on the other side, you don't want to throw them into something that they're going to spend 2 pages just trying to figure out what's going on here.
Right.
Then you maybe need a little sentence or something to set the table so that they know what's going on as they go into it. Because you don't want them spending time being confused. That doesn't leave a good impression.
Yes.
And, first and foremost, I think you want to pick something that leaves them wanting more. That doesn't mean it has to be a cliffhanger. But what you're going to want to pick something that, is compelling. And that looks like, there is more can be done here. That there's, some questions being asked, or there's some sort of action going on, and they want to continue reading. Right.
Hearing you say that, it made me think of something like Kickstarter. It might be a good analogy. When you present a project on Kickstarter, you're asking the public to like your ideas so much, and to like what you show them as a sample of your work, and what you show them as what this thing you're going to do with their money can become, that they're willing to invest. And it's the same with these panels.
Yes.
At the grants, you need to show them, this is the quality of work I do. This is my vision for what I'm going to do with this money, and I need to make you want it so much you can't help but say yes to giving me a grant.
Yes. And what you really want is to get one of those panelists to become your champion. And when you get into the bigger groups, they're going to champion that piece and say, yep, this is great, and and help. I mean, that does happen when you get into these grant meetings, because all of a sudden you've got a lot of very good work, and everybody reads things differently, And so when you just start talking about them and discussing them, if you've got a champion, that's always very helpful.
So true. So let's talk about the project.
Okay.
So you've got experience developing your own grant applications, and then you've also reviewed grant applications. So can you give us kind of a sampling of what people might propose to do with grant money? Like, what are the possibilities out there?
Well, it could be a lot of things. It could be to write a new piece of work. It could be to revise a piece of work that already exists in a draft form. It can be, again, this gets really wide. What depends on the grant. It could be used to market a piece of work. It can be used to independently publish a piece of work. I mean, it can be used for, I'm just trying to think, so many different things within, the scope of writing, not necessarily just preparing it, but can it be the business side as well?
Okay.
Depending on the grant. I mean,
right, of course.
So, I think the most traditional ones are for the writing of a project, but there are grants out there. The Arts Initiative grant actually does fund, like selling, selling the work and doing the advertising and
okay.
that type
So
of
marketing
thing.
even.
Marketing, that's the word.
Right. So you had mentioned using grant money to work with an editor, and I think you mentioned mentors as a possibility as well. So you could use the grant money to pay yourself, so you need to work fewer hours so that you can be a writer. You could use it, what about for something like childcare or buying a new computer, or, can we even go kind of out into those writing adjacent territories?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of them do allow for childcare, some equipment. There's probably some, look carefully at the equipment one, are there limits and, what can you ask for? But yeah, and hiring a manuscript editor or hiring a mentor. One of the things as you do the application and the panelists are going to be looking at is, where is this person in their career as a writer? And a beginning writer is probably more likely going to need a mentor type person as opposed to a line editor, for example. And so it needs to be like putting together where this person is at in their career with what they're asking for in the grant.
Okay. So if I am an emerging artist and I want money for marketing a book that I'm going to self-publish in 3 months, they might say, well, but, right? Or they might look at your writing sample and say, well, but, right? But if you say, you want the dots to connect, right? So if a panelist looks at your writing sample and says, there's talent here, there's a future here for this person, I would love to support this person, but I see major issues with plot or point of view, right? Because your panelists are experienced artists. And you say, I want marketing money, they're going to go, yeah, you aren't really ready for that. But if you say, I want to study craft with a mentor because I have a POV issue, they're going to go, perfect, right?
That's it exactly.
You're self-aware. We're on the same page. I want you to grow as an artist. And so that's the kind of connections that you need to make between your stage of your career and your project so that you and the panelists align. Right?
Yep.
Good. So speaking of stage of career, what about the CV or the resume? What would you say about that?
What needs to be, what should be on that is stuff that's relevant to this project, for sure. Your day job may not be quite as important as, classes you've taken, publications that you've done. If you have an interest in juggling, let's say, and you've been juggling for, I don't know, at this place for 6 years, write that type of thing on there. Things that would make sense given this project that you're proposing.
Okay. How does juggling make sense with the project that you're proposing?
Because it's a novel about juggling.
Okay.
And it's a juggler is going to different. I mean, whatever and part of this is part of the artist statement as well. Maybe if we just back up a little bit to the artist statement.
Yes.
That artist statement should contain, things that make you very well qualified to write this novel or these short stories or whatever this project is, because that means you're going to know this topic. You can have research can be part of your project as well as part of your proposal. That's fine, but to the extent that you have insider knowledge, or you have passions, that you volunteered, that you've been doing this, that you've been interested in this. Maybe you grew up on a boat, and this is a story about a boat, or certainly anything about ethnic, race, gender, culture. State those in the artist statements or somewhere in that package, because I think we're all very aware of appropriation, and we don't want to be funding any misappropriation of a culture or whatever. And it's to your advantage to say, hey, this is a story about Japanese Americans, and I am a Japanese American, and I have the credibility to write this story.
Right.
And so some of that's going to, will bleed into the resume or the CV, kind of depending on what it is. You're not going to have gender or something on your resume, but you would have, like interests and, passions or volunteer hours that you've done, schooling, things, publications. I think I said that. Things that make sense with the project and why you would be successful at doing that project.
Okay. Now, is the description of the project, your proposal for what you're going to do with the money, is that part of your artist statement, or are they two separate documents?
That's really specific to the grant.
Okay.
Some grants do have an artist statement, some don't. Some of them have just a project statement. But somewhere in that package, there's going to be some sort of an artist statement, and there's going to be some sort of project
description.
Project description.
Right, which may or may not include a budget.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the resume and the CV. So this is a lot. This is 3 or more documents that people need to prepare when applying for a grant. So, if my deadline, right, what advice would you give to people who want to prepare for a grant in terms of what it takes to put this stuff together in such a way that you stand a chance at, making it into the final rounds, if not winning a grant?
It takes a lot of time. More time than you think it should. I always think anyway. I'm into this going, wow, I put a lot of time into this. But you really do need to make it the very best that it can be. And there's a lot of, there's word counts or character count limits throughout the whole thing. So I always write in word processing, follow the character counts or the word counts, and then you start editing this down so that it is a very succinct package.
Right.
When you do some sort of a plan, I would suggest you be very succinct and clear. Because, this is the business side of this project. What are you trying to do? How are you going to do it? Be very logical. What are your steps?
Right. Right. So we as artists need to shine in our right-brained capacity with that writing sample. And then we also need to shine in our left-brain capacity, saying, detailing, here's what I want the money for, here's how I'm going to be responsible with that money, here's how I'm going to manage my time and, succeed at what I tell you I'm going to do with the money. And, jump through the hoops of those character counts and, proper formatting and such.
Proper format. The other thing that I would recommend is you be very specific. When you do this project plan, if you're going to use an editor, if you know the editors, you can say that person's name. If you've talked to them, I've talked to so-and-so, they've agreed to be a mentor in this project. I think that I'm going to use them for X number of hours. Their hourly rate is X amount. If you don't know a specific editor, have thought through, done some research as to what does it cost. I mean, how many hours do I think I would like to have? And then how many hours? And then what's the cost of that per hour? So the more specific you are, the better feeling that panelist judge is going to feel that this person knows what they're trying to do, and they've thought about it, and they have a good degree of, ability to succeed.
So as a panelist, you see, hundreds of applications. Is it hundreds?
Generally, like 50, I think is the group. If you're going to read through, all of this documentation.
Okay, so let's back up a step. You as an individual panelist see 50 that you discuss with a group of panelists?
Yes.
But then the State Arts Board didn't only get 50 prose applications in a given year, right? Yeah. So the competition isn't, your chances aren't really 1 in 50. So can you tell us what the process looks like, right? I throw my application into a pool of how many, and then how do we get down to the finalists and then to the winners?
Again, it varies a lot.
Sure.
I mean, I have read a lot more than that too. But the State Arts Board breaks it into 2 different pools, or panels, I think they call them actually. But whatever, there's 2 pools, and then there's like 6 or 7 panelists per pool. So you would get, for instance, let's just say there's 100 applicants. Each pool gets half of them, and then each person within that pool reads all of them. And then they'll get together and discuss them, and they're scored. Everyone gives them a score.
Okay.
And then those scores are all added up, and whoever the top numbers are the ones that are awarded the grants.
Okay.
That's one process. I have done another process where there were 2 of us, and I think there were 60 to 70 applications. We read them all and said, here are the top 10. And then our 2 top 10s were put together and given to the final judges to make a determination.
Okay.
So there's different ways to do it. There's some screener somewhere probably reading these.
Right. So as a panelist or a screener, what are the easy, yes pile, no pile decisions? What are kind of the markers you're looking for that are going to get someone into your yes pile, or that are definitely going to drop them in the no pile, It's the manuscript. I can't stress enough how important that manuscript is. That manuscript, and it's a manuscript just the same as, somebody reading for a publication, Right. It's a manuscript where it elicits some sort of emotional response from the reader, or intellectual inquiry, or some sort of feeling of, excitement about the manuscript. That's how you get into that yes pile. It's really carefully choosing that manuscript. Okay. So you've got a good manuscript. you're in this reader's yes pile. You get to the panel discussion with the group of readers. Mm-hmm. Now what does it come down to? What are the panelists going to have discussions about? What could make or break an application?
Boy, it could be about anything. It's they're going to talk about the strength of the manuscript. I mean, very few. No manuscript is perfect. You know, so where are the strengths and the weaknesses in the manuscript? What about the artist's plan? How doable does that plan look? Mm-hmm. It might be about the money, the budget. Are all the costs something that's allowable? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it gets into the gray areas about whether or not, does this fit within our guidelines? Okay. And I guess I would almost recommend that if you have something that's in the gray area, that you state it in the application. Mm-hmm. For instance, I was writing a novel about North Dakota, and I was going to probably need to make a trip to North Dakota. That's not funded. So instead of pretending that wasn't a part of it, I just said, I'd take a trip to North Dakota, and that would be totally funded by me personally. Mm-hmm. Or if you're in a degree program, sometimes this work is not allowed to be used as in a degree program. Then just state that I understand that this cannot be used in a degree program, and I would not do that, or some sort of explaining the issue if you think there's one out there, just so that people don't get tripped up on it. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So acknowledging your awareness of the issue gives the panelists comfort that they don't have to worry about funds being misallocated or something.
Right. Mm-hmm. And they're not going to spend time saying, do you suppose they're going to use this as part of their degree? And start discussing it in that manner.
Right. What kind of help is out there for applicants when you have that technical question like, is this project allowable? Or, I'm not sure if I qualify because, who do you reach out to?
There's probably a program director, or a program manager that's running it. And all the ones that I've worked with have been very helpful. They're probably artists themselves. Yeah. They're obviously very passionate about their program. They want to help people. They're on they're on your side. So reach out to them. Call or email. Yeah. They're also very, very busy people, and so I would highly recommend. Don't wait till the last minute to do this. Send them a couple weeks ahead of time to say, hey, got a question about this. Also, a lot of these programs have webinars or town hall meetings or different types of ways to learn more about the program, and I highly recommend going to those. Because even if it's some little tip that you hadn't thought about, it could be very, very helpful. It could be the difference between, a grant that's, an application that's given a grant and one that's not. Mm-hmm.
How close does it come? Do you have any sort of stories from the trenches? I know you have to respect people's privacy, obviously, and can't give specific details or names, but to give us a better picture of what this process is like, do you have any kind of anecdotes from the trenches you could share?
I guess I would just say the competition is fierce. Mm-hmm. And I had certainly grants that I looked at or applications that I looked at and thought were very worthy for grants, but they didn't get funded. Mm-hmm. And it's just a matter of, numbers, that at the, where that cutoff line, there's a bunch of applications here and here of that cutoff line. Right. And so keep applying. I mean, just because you didn't get it one year, you need to keep at it. Mm-hmm. Because there are lots of people that are right here. Yes. And, and it's a subjective process. Mm-hmm. You're right. Looking at this, and everyone looks at things differently. Mm-hmm. a different group of panelists. A lot of these programs do change the panelists up, I think, which is a good thing because then, there's different aesthetics being brought to the table. And then, what might have missed it one year will be a very high contender the next year. It just depends on who the group is.
Right. So we have to do our best to meet all of the objective qualifications, all of that left brain stuff, and then have a thick skin and realize that there's also a subjective aspect to this process.
It is. I mean, it is just like sending your work out for publication. The rejections are numerous, sadly.
Yes.
So it's better to, apply for 3 or something, than...
Yes.
And keep at it. I mean, I really firmly believe that.
Tickle in my throat. Yes, so let's talk about a subjective issue of bias. Is there a bias for traditional writers, MFA type writers versus indie writers, or for literary fiction versus genre fiction? Does that exist in your experience? What would you say to writers who might be concerned, well, I'm indie and I write, space operas. I can't apply for a grant, right? What would you say to that?
Yes, you can apply for a grant.
Good.
It really comes down to the quality of that manuscript. But I know in the go around that we did, we funded genre, fiction novels, fantasy novels. We funded a lot of YA, middle grade novels. It was really a wide variety of things. There were a couple projects in there that were looking to self-publish. That wasn't ever, we really never spent a lot of time thinking about that or talking about that. In fact, I know at least one of the people sitting at the table in our group that was having this discussion is someone who was self-published. So it wasn't looked down upon at all.
Right.
That said, there are certain grants that are kind of more niche grants. Maybe it is a more literary pool that person is looking for. Or it might be, conversely, the grants are for science fiction or fantasy novels or something like that too. It goes both ways. There certainly are some, that, I would send my work to some publications and I wouldn't to others, just based on what my work is and what they're looking for. I would, say the same thing about the grants. Okay.
So then due diligence, do your research, find out what kind of projects they like to fund and call the program director if you aren't sure if you fit in.
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm going to check my notes. Do you have anything you want to add to do committees, do panelists ever give feedback to applicants? Do you ever get info on why you maybe were passed up?
The Minnesota State Artist Initiative grants give a lot of feedback. That actually the panelist discussions are public, so you can come and listen to them on the day that they're discussed. They also record them.
Okay.
So you can ask for the recording of the discussion. Of when your application is up for discussion. Okay. I would highly recommend it. It's no fun to listen to, people being crabby about your work, for sure. But, it might be something just simple that, you just say, oh, okay, yeah, I need to do that. Or just learning what they were looking at that year anyway. And, in the group that I was with, it wasn't all just, tearing into all of these applications. We talked a lot about, what the strengths were, what was working well with them, and, where there were maybe areas for improvement. So, I think it's just a learning experience. So if you can get something like that, that's great.
Excellent. What would you like to add to the conversation? What advice would you give, or what stories from your own experience as a grant recipient and how it's affected your life as an artist?
I think being a grant recipient has done a lot for me in that it has gave me focus on the project. It's kind of what life gets in the way all the time.
Yes.
But it's been kind of nice to say, no, I've got this grant I'm working on. I got to go do this work, and it buys you some time from other people. But I think it also does for yourself too.
Right.
It's certainly good to see that somebody sees some value in what you're trying to do, and it's a little bit of a confidence booster too.
Right.
I think. So
validating for sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of things in putting together a grant package. That it takes a lot of time, but the rewards I think are great if you can do it.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Just having your own work, or I want to say existence as an artist, validated that way is huge. Yeah. We don't get enough of that in this culture, and and for many of us in our families, or it's like, you want to be a writer? Well, how are you going to do that?
Yeah.
So
it's kind of a lonely world in our little basements, all working on our manuscripts or our caves or whatever the word we call our little spot that we go to crawl into our head and find words to put on a piece of paper.
Well, thank you. This is wonderful. I hope everybody listening is inspired to go start searching for writers' grants that you can apply for and take this advice. Is there anywhere that people can find you, or do you have any events coming up?
In this time of COVID, no,
no,
I am not.
Okay. You'll be in the basement.
I'll be in the basement
with the opinionated cat and the
my dog
and your dog. Understood. Well, Susan, cheers. I am so glad you were able to come over and join the round table.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.